It is 3:30 in the afternoon on the 4th of June, 1913. 500,000 people are watching the King's horse round Tattenham Corner at Epsom. A small woman in a dark coat ducks under the white rail. She is 40 years old. Her name is Emily Davison. Inside the lining of her coat are 2 flags she has sewn into the fabric herself. In her pocket is a return train ticket. She raises her hands towards the bridle of the King's 3-year-old colt, Anma. 4 days later, she is dead. The King will telegram about his jockey first. If you enjoy the stories, the history books quietly trimmed back into respectable shape, subscribe so the next forgotten woman finds you instead of disappearing. I have spent months inside her letters and her prison files. You are going to hear all of them. Chapter 1. The Northumbrian Girl Who Read Too Much. She was born in Blackheath in 1872, but the wind of Northumberland blew through every letter she ever wrote. The official record places her birth on the 11th of October, 1872, at Roxburgh House, a substantial villa in the suburbs of southeast London. The street still exists. The villa does not. What survives is the parish register and a christening certificate that names her father as Charles Davison, retired merchant of Morpeth, and her mother as Margaret Casely, the much younger second wife. There is a particular kind of late Victorian household that pretends to be settled and is in fact already cracking. The Davison household was one of these. Charles had been a successful trader in Bishopgate and had taken his fortune and his first wife back north to Morpeth, where their 9 children grew up in comfort. The first, Mrs. Davison, died. Charles, in his late 50s, married Margaret Casely, a Northumbrian neighbour 27 years his junior. They moved south to Blackheath because that was where his retired peers had moved. They had 4 further children. Emily Davison was the third. The family was middle class by income and upper middle class by manners. The girls were educated by a governess and then sent to good schools. Emily attended Kensington High School and then, in 1891, Royal Holloway College in Egham, a foundation only 5 years old at the time. Royal Holloway had been built by the patent medicine millionaire Thomas Holloway in red brick and pale stone, in a wildly ambitious French chateau style, as a college for women. It was a building that announced, with every turret, that women might one day be educated in the same way as men. The interior corridors smelt of beeswax and steam pipes. Emily read English. She was, by every account, gifted, opinionated, and impatient. 2 things happened in the 4 years that followed, which broke the architecture of her life. In 1893, her father Charles Davison died suddenly at Longhorsley in Northumberland. Probate listed an estate of roughly £5,000. Once debts and the children of the first marriage were paid, the income available to Margaret and her 4 children at Longhorsley fell to perhaps £120 a year. The second event was the consequence of the first. Emily could no longer afford Royal Holloway. She wrote to the college, withdrew, and went looking for paid work as a teacher and governess. Most women of her class, in her position, in 1893, would have stopped there. Emily did not. She took a series of teaching posts across the south of England, the Midlands, and the West Country, lived in plain lodgings, and put away her wages. By 1895, she had saved enough to register as an external student paying her own way at St. Hugh's Hall in Oxford. St. Hugh's was a women's hall founded only 9 years earlier by Elizabeth Wordsworth, the principal of Lady Margaret Hall. Its student body was tiny, its ambitions were enormous. Emily took the final honours school in English language and literature in the summer term of 1895. She was awarded a first-class result by her examiners, the highest classification the university could confer. She was not, however, awarded a degree. Women were not permitted to graduate from the University of Oxford until 1920, 25 years later. She was permitted to know that she had passed at the top of her year. She was not permitted to put the letters after her name. She left Oxford on a hot afternoon in 1900, carrying her examiner's certificate in a leather wallet and the quiet beginning of a rage that would last the rest of her life. The wind of Northumberland blew at her back. The state she had been born into would not call her a graduate. By the time she next walked into a public building of importance, 16 years later, she would be ready to make it call her something else. Chapter 2. The Teacher Who Could Not Be Counted. A woman with first-class honours in English language and literature from Oxford was, in the eyes of the British state, a domestic. The classification was not figurative. The census taken on the night of the 31st of March, 1901, listed Emily Wilding Davison, aged 28, as a teacher, boarder, single. She was lodged in a guest house in Worthing, on the Sussex coast, working as an assistant teacher at a girls' school. Her wage was approximately £65 a year, plus board, paid in arrears. From this income, she sent a portion to her widowed mother in Longhorsley and saved the rest. There were no hot baths. There was no return train to anywhere unless she had bought the ticket herself. The teaching life she now led was a closed circuit. The available posts for an educated woman in 1901 were governess in a country house, assistant teacher in a girls' school, or, very rarely, headmistress of a small private establishment. The salaries were a fraction of what a male teacher with the same education could expect. The Burnham scales for elementary school teachers in the same year showed a male assistant on roughly £110 a year and a female assistant on around £80. A man teaching in a grammar school could expect £200 and a house. A woman with first-class Oxford honours could expect, at the very best, £90 and a small bedroom. The legal position was equally severe. Married women had only become legally distinct economic actors with the Married Women's Property Act of 1882. Single women could own property and sign contracts, but could not vote, could not serve on a jury, could not stand for Parliament, and could not, in many cases, keep their own children after a separation. Emily, who never married, was technically freer than her married sisters. The freedom was the freedom of an empty room. She could be enumerated by the British state every 10 years, and she could be taxed every year. She could not influence any government that took her taxes. She moved from Worthing to Edgbaston, where she taught at the Church of England College, then to a private household in Berkshire as a resident tutor to 2 girls, then back into schoolwork. She had a small library of literature and history that travelled with her in a wooden trunk. She read Shelley and Carlyle, Mill and Bunyan, Tennyson and the Brownings. She wrote letters to her mother almost every Sunday. She walked alone in the evenings. She joined a Sunday school. She also began to read the suffrage press. The first organised demand for women's suffrage had been presented to the House of Commons by John Stuart Mill in 1866, with a petition of 1,499 signatures. The Constitutional Suffrage Societies, led from 1897 by Millicent Garrett Fawcett, had laboured patiently for 40 years and had got nowhere. A new movement, the Women's Social and Political Union, founded by Emmeline Pankhurst in Manchester in October 1903, was prepared to be less polite. Its motto was "Deeds, not words." By 1906, it had moved its headquarters to London and was holding meetings within walking distance of Emily's lodgings in Russell Square. Emily attended a meeting in October 1906. The speaker was Annie Kenny, a former Lancashire mill girl who had been arrested with Christabel Pankhurst at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester in October 1905 for spitting at a policeman. Kenny spoke about her time in Strangeways prison and about the difference between asking for the vote and taking it. Emily Wilding Davison, who had spent 15 years asking and being ignored, listened. In November 1906, she signed her membership card. Her annual subscription was 1 shilling. She was 34 years old, unmarried, on a small teacher's wage, with an Oxford education the university had refused to acknowledge and a vote the state had refused to give her. She had also at last found the home that suited the shape of her anger. She would not teach again for very long. The British state was about to discover what happened when it stopped counting a clever woman. Chapter 3. The Night. She slept inside Parliament. On census night, the 2nd of April 1911, the only legal address in Britain that meant anything to her was the one her sex could not enter. The 1911 census was the first British census conducted under the new system designed by John Sidney Webb at the General Register Office. Householders themselves filled in the schedule. The returns were to be a definitive numerical photograph of the kingdom. Women, Emily and the Women's Social and Political Union argued, were the largest single category of human being whose lives the schedule would record and whose votes the state would still ignore. The union had organised what it called the Census Resistance Campaign. Members were urged either to refuse to be enumerated by leaving their houses overnight or to spoil their forms with the slogan, "No vote, no census." Sympathetic doctors had agreed to open their consulting rooms for all-night meetings. The Aldwych skating rink, on the corner of Drury Lane and the Strand, had been booked from midnight onward as a vast all-night roller skating party for women who refused to be at home in their husbands' houses. Hundreds of women glided in circles to a brass band until 5 in the morning. Emily Wilding Davison decided to take the protest further. She did not merely refuse to be enumerated at her lodgings in Russell Square. She would be enumerated, but at an address chosen with deliberate symbolic care. She would record her census residence as the House of Commons. This was not an idle gesture. To do it, she had to spend the night inside the Palace of Westminster. The new palace, rebuilt by Charles Barry and Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin after the Great Fire of 1834, was an enormous Gothic city of corridors and stairs, with over 1,100 rooms and roughly 3 miles of internal passages. Within it, the oldest surviving medieval space was the crypt chapel of St Mary Undercroft, restored by Edward Middleton Barry between 1860 and 1870 in vivid blue, gold, and crimson. A small broom cupboard opened off the crypt's ventilation passage. It was approximately 3 feet wide and 7 feet deep, with a single wooden door and a stone floor. Emily entered the Palace of Westminster on the afternoon of Saturday, the 1st of April. She was a known suffragette, and she had been arrested before. To enter unchallenged required composure. She walked in alongside a public tour, slipped away from the group near Westminster Hall, descended to the crypt level, and let herself into the broom cupboard. She closed the door behind her. She had brought sandwiches, a notebook, and a small lamp. She passed the rest of Saturday, Sunday, and most of Monday inside the cupboard. The schedule for census night was 9 p.m. Sunday the 2nd of April to 8 a.m. Monday the 3rd. Emily remained where she was. On Monday morning, a cleaner working in the crypt opened the cupboard door and discovered her. She was escorted to the police office on the premises. A police constable named Frank Kearney filled in a supplementary census schedule on her behalf. The entry survives in the National Archives at Kew. In the column headed Name and Address, it reads, Emily Wilding Davison. In the column headed Where Staying on the night of April 2nd, 1911, it reads, Found hiding in the crypt of Westminster Hall since Saturday. She had achieved exactly what she had set out to achieve. Her census residence on the night of the count was, formally, the seat of British sovereignty. There is one more detail to note. Her landlady in Russell Square, not knowing where her tenant had gone, had also entered her on the household schedule at the lodging house. Emily Davison is, as a result, the only known person to appear twice on the same census in two different locations on the same night. She had not refused to be counted. She had refused to be counted only once. She walked out of the Palace of Westminster on the morning of the 3rd of April, 1911, untouched and unarrested. The clerks of the House of Commons were embarrassed. The Speaker, James Luther, ordered the cupboard locked. The story did not break in the press for several days, but the British state had been written into the architecture of its own discomfort. A woman whose name it did not wish to know had inserted herself, by stealth, into the most photographed room in the kingdom. What she did next would make a national crime of what she had done. Chapter 4. The Tube That Made Her Bleed. She was force-fed 49 times, and the British government called it ordinary hospital treatment. The number is exact and is taken from the Holloway prison medical register and from her own diary entries, both of which survive. The procedure was carried out by Home Office doctors, acting under the orders of the Liberal Home Secretaries Reginald McKenna and his successors. It was performed on women whose only crime was the breaking of windows in pursuit of a constitutional right. To understand what was done to Emily Davison's body, it is necessary to understand the daily procedure inside Holloway Prison's hospital wing. Holloway, opened in October 1852 as the City House of Correction and rebuilt as a women's prison in 1903, was a Victorian fortress designed in pale yellow stock brick with crenellated towers, narrow loophole windows, and 4 wings radiating from a central rotunda. The hospital wing was on the 2nd floor of D Wing. The room set aside for force feeding contained a wooden chair with a metal back, 2 leather straps, a small table with surgical instruments, a glass jug, a metal funnel, and a coiled length of rubber tubing approximately 2 feet long and ½ an inch in diameter. The procedure was as follows. At a fixed time, generally 8 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, 2 female warders entered the prisoner's cell, sometimes accompanied by a wardress trained as a nurse. The prisoner was lifted, carried, or marched to the hospital wing. The warders held her arms and shoulders. The doctor, almost always a man, sat in front of her on a small stool. A leather gag, like a horse bit, was forced between the teeth. If the prisoner held her jaws closed, a steel wedge was used to lever them open, and a metal gag was screwed into place by a small ratchet. The doctor then took the rubber tube and pushed it either down the throat or, more commonly, up through one nostril and down into the stomach. He attached the metal funnel to the upper end of the tube and poured in a pre-prepared mixture of warm milk, raw egg, beef tea, glucose, and occasionally bromide or brandy. The pour was about a pint per session. It took 20 minutes. The pain itself was severe, but the after-effects were worse. The tube tore the lining of the throat and esophagus. Many prisoners vomited the contents back through the tube before the funnel could be removed. The aspiration of vomit into the lungs caused pneumonia. The repeated insertion of the tube through the nose tore the cartilage and caused chronic bleeding. Doctors who refused to perform the procedure, including the assistant medical officer Frank Moxon, resigned and gave public evidence. Moxon called the procedure in his pamphlet What Forcible Feeding Means. Emily Davison's first sentence had been in 1909, 2 months in Strangeways, Manchester, for obstruction. She had been arrested again in October 1909, in Strangeways, in Newcastle, in Aberdeen, and in Holloway. By March 1912, she was in Holloway for the 7th time. The sentence was 6 months for window breaking in Whitehall. She was placed initially on the ordinary diet. The Home Office decided, on its own initiative and without her requesting it, that her general health required her to be force-fed. The first feeding was on the 29th of February 1912. By the time of her death, 15 months later, she had been force-fed 49 times. She bled from her nose for weeks. She lost 2 teeth. She wrote a series of articles, smuggled out of the prison and printed by the Women's Social and Political Union, about what was being done to her. The state of Britain, in the years before the First World War, was inflicting on its own female citizens a procedure that would later be regarded by international law as a form of torture. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture has, since the year 2006, classified non-consensual force-feeding as a form of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. In 1912, on Home Office orders, it was being done twice a day, in the heart of the imperial capital, to women whose Oxford and Cambridge contemporaries were running the colonial service. This contradiction was the foundation on which the next stage of the militant movement was built. Emily Davison did not write much about her own pain. Her surviving notes are clinical, brief, and oddly serene. She had begun, at some point in the late spring of 1912, to think of her body as a kind of building. "The body," she wrote, "is the architecture in which the spirit is housed. If the architecture is to be ruined for a cause, let the cause be one worth the ruin." She closed her notebook. She returned to her cell. 2 weeks later, she would step out onto an iron balcony 3 stories above the prison floor and decide to ruin the architecture on her own terms. Chapter 5. The balcony drop that was supposed to kill her. In June 1912, she walked out of her cell, climbed onto the iron balcony of Holloway, and jumped. The balcony was on the 2nd floor of the D-wing rotunda, accessible by a narrow walkway between the cells. The drop to the flagstone floor below was approximately 30 feet. Halfway down, between the 2nd floor and the 1st, the prison authorities had recently fitted a horizontal mesh of wire netting. The netting was an explicit response to the increase in suicide attempts among hunger-striking suffragettes. Emily Davison had been force-fed continuously from late May. Her health was poor. She had, by her own private testimony in the article she would later write, decided that the moral cost of continuing under force-feeding was greater than the personal cost of ending her own life. She also had, characteristically, a strategic purpose. She believed that a high-profile death inside Holloway would generate enough press coverage to halt force-feeding entirely. She did not consider it suicide. She considered it sacrifice. On the morning of the 13th of June, 1912, she was returned to her cell after the 8 a.m. feeding. She waited until the warders had moved on to the next prisoner. She left her cell, walked along the walkway, climbed onto the iron handrail of the balcony, balanced for a moment, and dived headfirst toward the flagstones 30 feet below. The wire netting caught her. It broke her fall, but it did not stop it. She rolled off the netting and dropped a further 15 feet to the floor below. The crash brought warders running from all directions. She was unconscious. The prison doctor diagnosed a fractured collarbone, 2 cracked ribs, severe spinal bruising, and a head injury. She was carried to the prison hospital. She regained consciousness within the hour. By the afternoon, she had refused food. She was force-fed again that evening. The article she wrote in the days that followed, smuggled out of the prison in tight folds of paper, is one of the most important documents of the militant suffrage movement. It is titled, "The Price of Liberty." She wrote, "The idea in my mind was that one big tragedy may save many others." She wrote, "I felt that by nothing but the sacrifice of human life would the nation be brought to realize the horrible torture our women face." She wrote, "If I had been killed in the act, what an end to it." The article was published in the Suffragette under the editorship of Christabel Pankhurst in May 1913, less than 4 weeks before Epsom. The Holloway balcony was therefore the dress rehearsal for Tattenham Corner. Emily had tested the principle. She had tested the response. She had survived. The state had not stopped force-feeding. The press had reported a fall, not a martyrdom. She concluded, with the cold reason of a St. Hugh's first, that the death required for the cause would have to be public. It would have to be at a national ritual. It would have to be photographed. It would have to be impossible for the government to absorb in the small print of a Home Office statement. She left Holloway in the autumn of 1912. She was thinner. She had lost 2 stone. She walked with a slight limp from the unhealed spine injury. She returned to her lodgings, by then in Coram Street in Bloomsbury, sent a telegram to her mother in Long Horsley, and immediately began organising the next series of arson attacks on country houses and postboxes. Her work as a soldier of the Union resumed at the precise moment her colleagues believed she should be resting. The decision she had made on the iron balcony she did not share with anyone. Not yet. The wire netting that had caught her was reinforced by the Home Office. The prison authorities never again risked an internal balcony drop becoming a martyr's story. The balcony, however, had served its purpose. The next time Emily stepped off a high place, it would be the white rail of the Epsom Derby. The cost of the Holloway force-feeding regime in 1912, in the language of the period, can be reckoned in cold numbers. 84 suffragette prisoners were force-fed at Holloway in 1912. The average number of feedings per prisoner was 11. The total recorded feedings exceeded 900. Each session required 2 female warders at 24 shillings a week, a male medical officer at £800 a year, and a wardress nurse at 18 shillings a week. The drugs, the tubing, the cleaning of instruments, and the additional rations consumed by the prisoner after each session added a further 3 shillings and 6pence per feeding. The Home Office spent, in 1912 alone, an estimated £420 on the procedure that the British medical profession was already calling, in the pages of the Lancet, an instrument of torture. Emily kept her own counsel about the balcony jump for the rest of her life. She did not speak of it to her sister Letitia, to her mother in Long Horsley, or to Mrs. Green, her landlady. She wrote of it only in the article that would be printed in the Suffragette 11 months later. The pages of her private diary for June 1912 are blank. The decision she had made was not, in her view, an event to be recorded in the warm domestic prose of a private diary. It was a clinical conclusion, reached on the iron handrail of a Victorian prison, by a woman who had calculated the price of her own life and the value of the cause she served. The conclusion was final. Chapter 6. The Arson Army Behind the Quiet Schoolteacher. While she sat in her landlady's parlour writing letters about Shelley, she carried in her handbag chemicals to burn the Royal Mail. The contradiction was deliberate. The Women's Social and Political Union understood, by 1912, that its public face had to remain respectable enough for the parlours of Hampstead and Holland Park, while its underground operations did the political work that public protest had failed to do. The union's headquarters at Clement's Inn, off the Strand, occupied an entire upper floor of a barrister's chambers building. From its rooms went out the weekly Suffragette newspaper, the appeal letters for the Legal Defence Fund, the membership cards, and the train tickets for the union's salaried organisers in cities across Britain. Beneath this paperwork lived a second organisation. It had no formal name. It was the union's militant wing. Its members specialised in 3 forms of property attack: window breaking, letterbox destruction, and arson of unoccupied buildings. Window breaking was the entry-level discipline. A typical raid involved between 4 and 20 women, each carrying a small hammer wrapped in cloth in a muff or a coat pocket. The raid focused on a single street of government and West End commercial premises. The first wave of attacks, on the 1st of March 1912, broke an estimated 400 shop windows in Oxford Street, Regent Street, Piccadilly, the Haymarket, and Whitehall, and resulted in 220 arrests in a single hour. Emily Davison was not among the arrested for that raid, but she was a coordinator for at least 2 other West End operations later that year. Letterbox attacks were her own particular specialism. The first known Suffragette letterbox attack was carried out by Emily on the 8th of December 1911 on a pillar box in Parliament Square. She walked up to the box, opened her handbag, took out 2 small glass vials, broke them against the side of the box, and dropped them in. The vials contained a mixture of yellow phosphorus dissolved in water with a small quantity of potassium chlorate. The chemistry was rudimentary, but it worked. The mixture, once oxygen reached it, smouldered and then caught fire. The letters inside the box, soaked in phosphorus, burned thoroughly enough to destroy them. She walked away. She was arrested 2 streets later and charged with arson of His Majesty's mails. The sentence was 6 months. Over the following 18 months, letterbox attacks became a national operation. The Post Office reported 5,000 letters destroyed in the first 6 months of 1913. Pillar boxes across central London, the West Midlands, Manchester, Edinburgh, and Cardiff were targeted. The chemistry was simplified into a small glass tube with a sulfuric acid stopper. The letterbox campaign was Emily Davison's tactical innovation. The campaign was sustained and refined after her death until the outbreak of war in August 1914. The most extreme tactic was country house arson. By the spring of 1913, the Union had identified a list of vulnerable targets: unoccupied second houses owned by anti-suffrage politicians and their wives. Lloyd George's new country house at Walton Heath in Surrey, still in the final stages of construction, was bombed by Emily Davison and Christabel Pankhurst's associate Emily Phipps on the night of the 18th of February 1913. 2 small nail bombs, set with an alarm clock fuse, exploded at 5 a.m., destroying part of the roof and the upper bedrooms. No one was injured. Emily Davison was almost certainly one of the women who placed the bombs, although she was never charged. Emmeline Pankhurst, who had taken full public responsibility for the act in a speech the following day, was sentenced to 3 years penal servitude in April 1913. She entered Holloway and began the cycle of hunger strike, release, and rearrest that would dominate the spring. By April 1913, the Home Office, led by Reginald McKenna, was politically embarrassed by the public visibility of force-feeding and equally embarrassed by the country house bombings. McKenna's solution was the Prisoners' Temporary Discharge for Ill Health Act, passed on the 25th of April, 1913, and immediately known to everyone in the country as the Cat and Mouse Act. The new law allowed the Home Office to release a hunger-striking prisoner on a temporary licence as soon as her health became critical, and to rearrest her once she had recovered. The Home Office calculated that this would diffuse the martyrdom narrative. It calculated wrongly. The Cat and Mouse Act had 3 consequences for Emily Davison in particular. First, it removed her most reliable form of personal protest. There was now no point in hunger striking, because the state would simply discharge her, leave her with a constable on the doorstep, and rearrest her once she had eaten. Second, it confirmed for her that the British state was now capable of indefinite tactical innovation against the militant women, and that ordinary methods of protest had been exhausted. Third, and most importantly, it removed the moral pressure of public sympathy for force-fed prisoners. The public had been horrified by force-feeding. The public would not be horrified by a woman released for medical reasons and rearrested 2 weeks later. On the morning of the 2nd of June 1913, Emily wrote her last article for the Suffragette. It is short. It argued that the cause now required, more than ever, a single act of public visibility that the state could not absorb. She closed the article, posted it to Christabel Pankhurst in Paris, and went out to buy a return train ticket to Epsom. The Derby was 48 hours away. The next chapter of her life would be the last. Chapter 7. The morning of the 4th of June. She woke at her London lodgings, sewed 2 flags into the lining of her coat, and bought a return ticket to Epsom. The lodgings were in Coram Street, Bloomsbury, where she had been living since her release from Holloway in October 1912. The landlady was a Mrs. Green, a widow with 2 small children, who had been an unpaid quartermaster of the suffragette movement for several years. The room was on the 2nd floor at the back, looking onto a sooty yard with a single sycamore tree. Emily slept in a single iron bed, under a wool blanket from Northumberland. Wednesday, the 4th of June, 1913, dawned warm and slightly hazy over central London. The newspapers carried the racing card. The favourite was Grandeur, owned by the betting magnate Charles Bower Ismay, brother of the chairman of the White Star Line. The King's horse, Anmer, a 3-year-old bay colt by Florizel II out of Antrim, was an outsider at 20-1. The Derby was the first Wednesday of June, the great public ritual of the racing calendar, attended by the reigning monarch in person. The royal box would seat King George V, Queen Mary, and the Prince of Wales. The crowd was expected to number close to 500,000, the largest single-day gathering in the British calendar outside of a coronation. Emily rose early. She washed in cold water and dressed in her best clothes: a dark grey wool skirt, a high-collared cream blouse, a black wool coat that reached almost to her ankles, and a wide-brimmed straw hat. She wore sensible black leather boots. She had laid out the coat on her bed the night before. Sewn into the inner lining of the coat, between the wool and the cotton lining cloth, were 2 flags. They were each approximately 18 inches wide and 24 inches long. They were the suffragette colours: a horizontal band of purple at the top, a horizontal band of white in the middle, and a horizontal band of green at the bottom. Their long edges were finished with bias binding. Each was attached to the inner lining of the coat by a series of small loops, sewn with cotton thread by Emily herself the night before. To free them, she would only have to slide her hand into the coat and pull 2 release strings. She ate a breakfast of bread, marmalade, and tea. She wrote a short note to her mother in Longhorsley, which she did not post. She wrote a second note to Mrs. Green, which she left on the kitchen table. The second note thanked the landlady for her kindness and asked her, in the event of any difficulty, to telegraph Edith Howe Martin at the Women's Social and Political Union Office. Edith. Howe Martin was a senior officer of the Union and had been the secretary of the census resistance campaign 2 years before. Emily walked to Russell Square. She caught the Underground from Russell Square to Charing Cross. From Charing Cross, she walked to Victoria Station, the South London terminus from which the special Derby trains were running every 15 minutes. She bought a return ticket to Epsom Downs. The ticket was a buff-coloured rectangle of card, printed in black. It read, "Victoria to Epsom Downs, second-class return, 95 pence." The fact of the return ticket has confused historians for more than a century. A woman intending suicide does not usually buy a return ticket. A woman intending a public demonstration with a 50-50 chance of survival might. She boarded the 11:17 train. She sat by the window. She wrote nothing for the journey. The carriage was crowded with men in straw boaters going to the Derby for the day. They paid her no attention. She arrived at Epsom Downs station shortly after midday and joined the long line of racegoers walking up the chalk path to the downs. She stopped at a small refreshment tent and bought a glass of weak shandy. She paid in coppers. She watched the crowd. By 2:30, she had taken her place at Tattenham Corner. Tattenham Corner is the long left-handed bend, 6 furlongs from the finish, where the field rounds the most dangerous turn of the course. The bend is also the place at which the runners are most spread out and the angles of view are best. Emily stood among the spectators against the inside white rail. She did not look at the parade ring. She did not bet. She waited. A small bronze plaque was, many years later, placed at the precise spot at which she stood. It reads only, Emily Davison, Suffragette, 4th of June, 1913. In 1913, there was no plaque. There was only a small 40-year-old woman in a dark coat with 2 flags sewn into the lining and a return train ticket in her pocket. The crowd around her did not know her name. The newsreel cameramen had set up their tripods further along the inside rail, opposite the royal box. The starter was ready. The 15 runners were at the post, 1.5 miles away. The race was about to begin. The scale of what was about to happen, in the language of pounds and shillings, was the scale of the British state at the height of its empire. The Derby Stakes prize money in 1913 stood at £6,450 for the winner, equivalent to roughly £750,000 in the money of the present day. The total Derby Day takings, including admission, betting, hospitality, and railway traffic, ran to several £100,000 in a single afternoon. The Metropolitan Police deployed 900 constables to manage the crowd. The Great Western, the London and South Western, the London Brighton and South Coast, and the South Eastern and Chatham Railways together ran more than 100 special trains into Epsom Downs station that morning. The afternoon's takings at the official tote stood at £82,000. The favourite, Grandeur, had been backed at 4-1 with £250,000 in cumulative bets across the country. The whole apparatus of the British ruling class was, on the 4th of June, 1913, gathered on a single square mile of Surrey chalk to watch 15 3-year-old horses round a left-handed bend. She did not buy a programme. She did not look at the runners. She had read the racing card on the train. She knew Anma was running. She knew the King and Queen were in the royal box. She knew the runners would be most spread out on the bend in front of her. She knew the cameras were running. She knew, in short, exactly what she was about to do. Chapter 8. The 6 seconds that changed everything. At 3:30 on Derby Day, she ducked under the white rail and raised her hands towards a bay colt called Anma. The race had begun at 3:15. The runners had set off at a fast pace under a hot sun. By the time they reached the top of Tattenham Hill, 6 furlongs from the finish, the field had begun to spread. As they came down the hill into Tattenham Corner itself, the leaders were on the inside rail, with the rest of the field strung out across the width of the track. The events that followed have been forensically reconstructed in the century since. 3 separate film cameras were running. The Path News camera, the Gaumont camera, and the topical budget camera each captured the corner from different angles. In 2013, on the centenary of her death, a Channel 4 documentary, Claire Balding's Secrets of a Suffragette, brought together all 3 pieces of film for the first time, slowed them frame by frame, and reconstructed exactly what Emily Davison did and at what speed. The films show the following. As the leaders rounded Tattenham Corner, Emily ducked smoothly under the white wooden rail. She stepped onto the turf of the course. She did not run. She walked forward perhaps 2 yards. The first 4 horses, including the favourite Grandeur, passed her at full gallop. She turned to face the next group of runners as they came round the bend. The king's horse, Anmer, ridden by Herbert Jones in the royal colours of purple, scarlet and gold, was at the back of this group. She raised her hands. The slowed path footage shows clearly that her hands rose towards the bridle of Anmer, not its body. She appears, in frame, to be reaching to attach something to the horse. The Channel 4 analysis concluded that she was attempting to fix one of her purple, white and green flags either over the bridle or to the saddle. The flag, the analysis suggested, was already in her right hand. She had pulled it out of her coat lining as the leaders passed. She had between 1 and 2 seconds to make contact. Anmer was travelling at approximately 35 miles per hour. Emily's right shoulder struck the horse's chest. The horse's lower legs caught her at the level of her waist. She was thrown to the ground. Anmer's hooves came down on her head and chest. The horse somersaulted forwards. Herbert Jones was thrown clear and landed heavily on the turf about 12 feet beyond. The remaining horses swerved around the obstacle and continued the race. The total elapsed time between Emily stepping onto the track and being struck was approximately 6 seconds. The actual collision was less than half a second. The race continued. Grandeur won the derby on a steward's technicality after the favourite Grandeur was disqualified. The crowd at Tattenham Corner roared. Members of the public ran onto the track. A constable raised Emily's head and saw that her eyes were closed. Herbert Jones, 22 years old, sat up on the grass with blood running down his face. The royal box, half a mile away by the finish, knew nothing of the incident for several minutes. King George V's first telegram of the afternoon, sent from the royal box to Buckingham Palace, asked after his jockey. The text survives. It reads, "Very disappointing day. Poor Anmer fell. Jones badly concussed." Queen Mary, in her diary, used the word horrid. She did not name Emily. Neither the King nor the Queen mentioned the suffragette by name in any of their private correspondence for several days. Emily Davison was carried on a stretcher to the medical tent, and from there in an ambulance van to Epsom Cottage Hospital, a small charitable institution on Alexandra Road. She was admitted at 4:10 p.m. with a fractured skull, a fractured base of the spine, and severe internal bruising. The senior surgeon on duty, Dr. Hubert Peacock, recorded in his notes that she was unconscious, with shallow breathing, and that he expected her to die within hours. She did not die within hours. She lay in a single bed in a small ward, screened off from the other patients, for 4 days. 2 suffragette nurses were permitted to attend her. Telegrams arrived from across the country. Telegrams of abuse were also delivered. One read, "In coarse capitals, hope you suffer torture until you die." The hospital staff sorted the post and burned the worst of the letters before her sister Letitia, summoned by telegram from her home in Brittany, could see them. The race itself, the official record continues to record, was won by Grandeur in 2 minutes 37.6 seconds. The headline of the next day's racing column in the Times made no mention of Emily Davison. The country had 4 days to argue about what she had been trying to do. She had 4 days to do the only thing left to her, which was to die in such a way that the country could not look away. The mechanics of what the films show, when slowed to a quarter speed and frame analysed, reveal a calmness of intention that the contemporary press could not see at full speed. Emily Davison's body language at the moment of stepping under the rail is composed. She does not run. She does not stumble. She does not lurch. She steps deliberately, the way a person steps onto a road they have already decided to cross. The contemporary press described her as flinging herself at the horse. The film shows her standing still. The horse came to her at 35 miles per hour. She raised her arms. She turned her face toward the bridle. The flag, in her right hand, was raised toward the horse's neck. The collision was the moment at which the British Crown and the British militant women met physically at the speed of a thoroughbred in front of 500,000 witnesses with 3 film cameras running. The Pathé News footage of the collision was screened in every cinema in Britain within 48 hours. By the evening of the 5th of June, 1913, an estimated 4 million people had seen the moving image of Emily Davison's collision with the King's horse. This was, by a wide margin, the largest single audience for a piece of news film in the history of the United Kingdom up to that point. The new medium of cinema, only 10 years old in its modern form, had become the instrument of the most public death the British state had ever inflicted on one of its own citizens. The Home Office, watching the cinema receipts climb, understood almost immediately that the political damage of the Derby collision was on a scale it had never previously faced. Whatever Emily Davison had intended at Tattenham Corner, what she had achieved was an act of political communication on the scale of a coronation. The cinema audiences kept growing. The political class kept arguing. And in the small ward at Epsom Cottage Hospital, the woman who had walked under the white rail kept dying. Chapter 9. The 4 days at Epsom Cottage Hospital. She never opened her eyes again, but the country had 4 days to argue about what she had been trying to do. The press was divided immediately. The Times described her as a desperate woman whose action was condemned by all reasonable people. The Daily Mirror, which printed the only clear photograph of the collision, was more measured. It described the event as a tragedy. The Manchester Guardian, alone among the major papers, argued that whatever the merits of her tactic, her sincerity could not be questioned. The argument inside the suffragette movement was sharper. Christabel Pankhurst, writing in the Suffragette from Paris, declared without hesitation that Emily had intended a deliberate martyrdom. Her purpose, Christabel wrote, was to give her life for the cause. Sylvia Pankhurst, by then estranged from her mother and sister, took a more careful position. She believed Emily had intended a high-risk demonstration, not a certain death. Edith Howe Martin, who knew Emily personally, said only that Emily had been preparing herself for the possibility of her own death for at least a year. The question of what Emily had been trying to do has been answered, in different ways, several times since. The strongest evidence for a deliberate martyrdom is her own article, The Price of Liberty, published in the Suffragette only a few weeks before. The strongest evidence against a deliberate suicide is the return train ticket in her pocket, the contents of her shopping basket, and the fact that she had paid for her room a week in advance. The forensic film analysis of 2013 suggested an in-between possibility. She had intended a public demonstration of overwhelming visibility. She had calculated that the chance of survival was perhaps 50%. She had accepted that the chance of death was equally 50%. She had judged that 50% was an acceptable risk for the cause. Inside the small ward at Epsom Cottage Hospital, she was unconscious throughout. The medical record kept by Dr. Peacock survives. It records temperature, pulse, respiration, and reflex testing at intervals throughout each of the 4 days. By the second day, the 6th of June, the surgeon noted increasing intracranial pressure. By the third day, the 7th of June, he noted a developing pneumonia. By the morning of the 8th of June, her pulse was thready and her breathing irregular. The 2 suffragette nurses who attended her, Edith Hyde and Vera Home, sat with her by turns. They reported no return to consciousness, no word, no movement of the eyes. her sister Letitia arrived from Brittany on the morning of the 7th of June. She had not seen Emily for 3 years. She sat by the bed for the whole of the next 24 hours. She held her sister's hand. She prayed. The headquarters of the Women's Social and Political Union at Clement's Inn was a single white knuckle of activity throughout the 4 days. Christabel Pankhurst sent telegrams from Paris every 2 hours. Edith Howe Martin coordinated the publicity. The press waiting outside the hospital reached over 40 reporters by the 3rd day. The hospital staff struggled to maintain the routine of the wider ward. The mayor of Epsom himself attended on the 2nd day. King George V sent a telegram which was, by the standards of the time, neutral in tone. It expressed regret. It did not condemn. Emmeline Pankhurst, who was at the time on a temporary licence under the Cat and Mouse Act, was inside her flat at Lincoln's Inn under police surveillance. She made the political decision to defy the surveillance and to attend the hospital. She was arrested in the doorway of her flat the moment she stepped outside. She was returned to Holloway and put back on hunger strike. She would be released again within 48 hours. Emily Wilding Davison died at 4:45 on the afternoon of the 8th of June, 1913. The ward sister noted the time as 16:45. The cause of death was given as fracture of the base of the skull. She was 40 years and 8 months old. The coroner's inquest at the town hall in Epsom on the 10th of June 1913 returned a verdict of death by misadventure. The coroner, George Garson, formally instructed the jury that there was no clear evidence of an intention to die. The verdict satisfied no one. The Home Office regarded it as a sensible avoidance of the political question. The Women's Social and Political Union regarded it as a refusal to acknowledge a deliberate sacrifice. Christabel Pankhurst, in her editorial in the Suffragette that week, used the title that has stuck to Emily Wilding Davison ever since. She called her simply the first martyr of the women's movement. The body was released to the family on the 11th of June 1913. A simple wooden coffin was prepared at a London undertaker. The coffin was to be conveyed by horse-drawn hearse from St George's Church, Bloomsbury, where a service of remembrance would be held, to King's Cross Station for the journey north to Northumberland. The route of the procession was to be the longest single funeral procession in London since the death of William Ewart Gladstone in 1898. The Women's Social and Political Union had 4 days to prepare. They prepared well. Chapter 10. The funeral that London could not look away from 6,000 suffragettes in white walked behind her coffin, and 50,000 Londoners stood in silence on the pavement. The date was Saturday the 14th of June, 1913. The day was warm. The procession formed up at Victoria Station, where the coffin had been brought by special train from Epsom that morning. From Victoria, the route ran up Buckingham Palace Road, past Buckingham Palace itself, along the Mall, through Trafalgar Square, up Charing Cross Road, along Bloomsbury Way to St George's Church, Bloomsbury. Total distance, roughly 3.5 miles. Total walking time, just under 2 hours. The Women's Social and Political Union had organised the order of the procession with a precision that the Earl Marshal himself would have respected. At the head walked a guard of suffragette officers in academic dress, including those, like Emily, who held first-class results from Oxford and Cambridge they had not been allowed to graduate from. Behind the guard rode a single woman on a white horse, dressed in white robes, holding a wooden cross. The figure on the horse was Charlotte Marsh, a former architecture student who had been arrested with Emily at Manchester in 1909. Behind Charlotte Marsh walked the immediate honour guard of 6 suffragettes, carrying a black silk banner inscribed with the words, "Deeds, not words." Behind the honour guard came the horse-drawn hearse, an open carriage drawn by 4 black horses with purple, white and green plumes. The coffin lay open to view in the hearse, draped in a purple silk pall embroidered with the word Ascendancy. 2 further banners flanked the coffin, one of which carried the text of Emily's last published article, The Price of Liberty. Behind the hearse walked the body of the procession itself. The first block, in white dresses with sashes of purple, white and green, were the unmarried suffragette officers. The second block, in black, were the married suffragettes and the widows. The third block, in academic dress, were the graduates the universities had refused to graduate. The fourth block, in working clothes, were the trade union and East End women. The fifth block, in the dress of various professions, were the doctors, lawyers, teachers, and journalists who supported the cause. Behind them, in a separate, slow movement, walked the men of the Men's League for Women's Suffrage, total marchers, just over 6,000. The crowd on the pavement was estimated by the Metropolitan Police at 50,000. The figure was almost certainly an understatement. The Pathé News film of the funeral, 4 minutes and 12 seconds in length, shows continuous walls of spectators on both sides of the route, several deep, removing their hats as the hearse passed. The film is silent. The contemporary newspaper reports describe a striking silence in the crowd. There was no cheering. There was no jeering. There was a low hum of comment, then quiet, as each section of the procession passed. At St. George's Church, the funeral service was conducted by the Reverend Forbes Jackson. The church was filled to its capacity of 1,200. The hymns included Fight the Good Fight and Nearer, My God, to Thee. The reading was from the Sermon on the Mount. The eulogy was delivered by the Reverend Reginald Forbes, who described Emily as a woman who had given her life for the freedom of her sisters, in obedience to her conscience. The service ended with the singing of Onward, Christian Soldiers, a hymn that Emily had marked in her prayer book. The coffin was then taken by horse-drawn hearse from St. George's Bloomsbury to King's Cross Station. The route was a further half a mile. The crowd along the route was equally dense. At King's Cross, the coffin was placed in a guard's van of the 4:10 p.m. Newcastle Express. The train left King's Cross on time. The suffragette guard travelled with the coffin in the next carriage. A second, smaller procession of approximately 400 Northumbrian suffragettes was waiting at Morpeth station when the train arrived shortly before midnight. The burial took place the following Monday morning, the 16th of June, 1913, at St. Mary the Virgin Churchyard in Morpeth. The service was small. The mourners included her mother, Margaret Davison, her sister, Letitia, and a small delegation from the Women's Social and Political Union. The family had asked for privacy. The local press respected the request. The coffin was lowered into the Davison family grave beneath an oak tree at the northern end of the churchyard. The headstone, ordered by her mother, was carved with the words, Emily Wilding Davison, B.A., who gave her life for the cause of liberty. Beneath the inscription is the motto she had carried for 7 years, deeds, not words. The funeral was a public phenomenon. It was the last great suffragette march. It was filmed, photographed, reported in every major newspaper in the country and across the empire. It was the event at which the British public became aware, in a way it had never been aware before, of the depth of feeling within the women's movement. The political class noticed. The political class did not yet act. Chapter 11. The Jockey Who Could Not Stop Dreaming. 15 years after Anma's hooves came down, Herbert Jones laid a wreath at Emmeline Pankhurst's funeral. The funeral was held at St. John's Smith Square, Westminster, on the 18th of June, 1928. Emmeline Pankhurst had died at the age of 69 on the 14th of June, 12 days before the Equal Franchise Act was due to extend the parliamentary vote to all British women on the same terms as men. The mourners included her surviving daughter Christabel, members of Parliament from all three major parties, and a large delegation of the surviving members of the Women's Social and Political Union. Among the wreaths was one whose card read, "To do honour to the memory of Mrs. Pankhurst and of Miss Emily Davison." The wreath was sent by Herbert Jones, the jockey who had ridden the King's horse Anmer at the Epsom Derby of 1913. He was, by then, 47 years old. He had retired from race riding in 1923 after a leg injury. He worked as a horse trainer at his home in Epsom. He had not been a public figure for more than a decade. The wreath was reported quietly in the next day's newspapers. The story of Herbert Jones is the story of what happens when a working man becomes accidentally entangled in the political martyrdom of a stranger. He had ridden Anmer in good faith. He had ridden out of the royal stables that morning. He had been thrown at Tattenham Corner and concussed. He had been examined at the same Epsom Cottage Hospital that received Emily Davison. He had been released within 24 hours. He returned to his home in Epsom. He returned to riding. He won 12 more races over the next 3 years. He had nightmares. He told his second wife, Mary Lyons, whom he married in 1916, that he saw Emily Davison's face every time he closed his eyes. He told a Sporting Life journalist in a 1940 interview that he had been haunted by that poor woman's face for 27 years. The wreath at Emmeline Pankhurst's funeral was the closest he came to a public statement. He sent it without making a press announcement. The wreath card was reproduced in the Suffragette press only briefly. It was not until decades later, when historians began to reconstruct the long afterlife of the militant suffragette movement, that the wreath was recovered as evidence of the moral weight Jones had carried. He had been a working-class man, a tenant farmer's son from West Sussex, a stable lad turned professional jockey. He had not had a political opinion in his life. He had been the unintended human instrument of a political martyrdom. He had carried that weight every day for 15 years. The Equal Franchise Act of 1928, passed on the 2nd of July, 14 days after Emmeline Pankhurst's funeral, extended the parliamentary vote to all women on the same terms as men. Approximately 5 million additional women were enfranchised. Combined with the 10 million women enfranchised by the Representation of the People Act of 1918, the total number of women added to the British electorate as a direct result of the suffragette campaign was approximately 15 million. Herbert Jones lived for a further 23 years. He developed depression in the late 1940s. He suffered from gas poisoning from a faulty geyser in his Epsom kitchen in 1950. He never fully recovered. On the 17th of July, 1951, he hanged himself in the kitchen of his home in Epsom. He was 69 years old. He was the last surviving direct witness to the Derby of 1913 who had touched it physically. His obituary in the Times mentioned the Derby. It did not mention Emily Davison by name. The Crown, in the form of King George V, had survived the Derby of 1913 comfortably. King George VI, his son, had been 10 years old at the time and had no memory of the event. Queen Elizabeth II, who came to the throne on the 6th of February 1952, 6 months after Herbert Jones's death, was the first British monarch to inherit a kingdom in which women had been voting on the same terms as men for the whole of her conscious life. The chain of causation between Tattenham Corner and Westminster was no longer visible from the throne. It was, however, fully present in the law. The political class that Emily Davison had sought to address had been, by the time of her death, deaf for 60 years. It became, very slowly, capable of hearing. By 1928, the year of the Equal Franchise Act, the principle that women were full constitutional citizens was no longer in serious dispute. By 1970, the year of the Equal Pay Act, the principle that women's economic value should be the same as men's was at least notionally in law. By 2020, the year a statue of Emily Davison was unveiled in Morpeth town centre by the playwright Maxine Peake, the principle that her name should be permanently written into the public architecture of Britain was no longer controversial. None of this would have happened in the way it did without the woman who had ducked under the white rail at Tattenham Corner 110 years before. Chapter 12. The Cupboard, the Bench, and the Empty Cell. 3 places in Britain still hold the memory of Emily Davison, and none of them is the one the Crown would have chosen. The first is a small wooden cupboard in the crypt of St Mary Undercroft in the Palace of Westminster. The cupboard is approximately 3 feet wide and 7 feet deep, and is set into the stone wall of the medieval Undercroft, restored by Edward Middleton Barry. On its door is a small brass plaque, fixed there by the Labour MP Tony Benn in the year 2000, when he was still a member of the House. The plaque records that Emily Davison hid in this cupboard on the night of the 2nd of April 1911, in order to give her census address as the House of Commons. The plaque is now part of the official parliamentary tour. Visitors are taken to it. The cupboard, the door, and the plaque survive intact. The second is a small wooden bench at Tattenham Corner on Epsom Downs Racecourse. The bench was placed there by the local Epsom and Ewell Borough Council in 1993, on the 80th anniversary of her death. The bench bears a small bronze inset plaque, no more than 6 inches by 4, which reads, "On this spot, on the 4th of June, 1913, Emily Davison stepped onto the racecourse and was struck by His Majesty's horse Anmer. She died 4 days later for the cause of women's suffrage." The bench faces the racecourse. The white rail in front of it has been replaced several times since 1913, but the line of the rail has not moved. The third is an empty space. Holloway Prison was closed by the Ministry of Justice on the 18th of July 2016. It had become the wrong shape for modern incarceration. The site was sold to a London housing developer for £281 million. The buildings were demolished between 2018 and 2022. The footprint of the prison is now a housing estate. A small portion of the Victorian fabric was preserved as a listed structure. The original prison gates of 1852, in red brick and Bath stone, with the figure of justice carved in relief above the lintel. A walking trail through the new estate marks the line of the D-wing rotunda. Visitors can stand on the precise spot where Emily Davison threw herself off the iron balcony in June 1912. There is no plaque. Beyond these 3 places lies a 4th. St Mary the Virgin Churchyard, Morpeth, contains the Davison family grave at the northern end of the burial ground. The grave is well maintained. Suffragette colours are tied to the iron railings around it almost every day. On the 8th of June each year, the anniversary of her death, the Northumberland Women's Institute lays a wreath. In 2018, on the 105th anniversary of her death, a bronze statue of Emily Davison was unveiled in Morpeth town centre by Maxine Peake. The statue shows her standing in her dark coat, holding one of the 2 flags she had sewn into the lining of that coat 105 years before. The flag is open. The wind, sculpted into the bronze, is at her back. What does her story finally tell us? It tells us that a single, educated, devout, mortgage-less Northumbrian woman, who had been refused her degree by Oxford and her vote by Westminster, calculated over 15 years of escalating political failure that the British state would only respond to a death photographed in public on its own grandest stage. She was right. The vote that she could not cast in 1913 was cast by 15 million British women between 1918 and the present day. The political class that had refused to hear her became, in the slow turning of the 20th century, the political class that no longer refused to hear women. There is, however, a darker side to that legacy. It is a hard truth that the British political system has rarely responded to peaceful argument alone. It responded to Daniel O'Connell only after a year of mass political demonstration. It responded to the Chartists only after the Great Hunger. It responded to the Irish nationalists only after the Easter Rising. It responded to the trade unions only after the Tony Pandy riots. It responded to the women's movement only after Emily Davison's body was carried off the turf at Tattenham Corner. The architecture of the British state is built on the bones of those who refused to be ignored. The Palace of Westminster, Holloway Prison, and Epsom Downs are not three innocent buildings. They are three faces of the same political system. Emily Davison's story is the story of what one woman did when she understood the shape of that system from the inside. The wind of Northumberland blew through every letter she ever wrote. It blows still, across her grave, through the cupboard in the crypt, past the bench at Tattenham Corner, and over the empty footprint of the prison they could not keep her in. She was 40 years old. She was given a first-class result by an Oxford that would not call her a graduate. She is now, by the slow vote of a country that took 100 years to catch up with her, called something else. She is called what she was on the 8th of June, 1913, when the ward sister at Epsom Cottage Hospital wrote the time of death as 5:15. She is called the woman who died so that women could vote. And that is what she is. If this story moved you, subscribe so the next forgotten woman finds you as well. Then leave a comment with where you are watching from and tell me what you think Emily was trying to do at Tattenham Corner, deliberate martyr or calculated risk. Share this with anyone who still thinks the vote was given freely. It was not.